In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or way to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human can actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man, who claimed he had nothing left to live for, was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve in his brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with the outside world, or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. The scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried out that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he can communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of the scientists had left that study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became more distressed, seeing the voices were overwhelming. Every waking moment, his conscience was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit pain response. He begged for the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic only worked for 3 days, and still he had severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later did he begin to scream and claw at his non-functioning eyes, hoping to sense the physical world. The hysterical subject was now hearing the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness." For 5 hours straight, he continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were only convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of his flesh from his arms. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted, struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject manually rehydrated due to constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite of his blindness, made focused contact with the scientist. For the first time in the study, he whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He's offended." And his vitals stopped. There is no apparent cause of death. Follow-up study, 2000, Dr. G.F., Department of Neurology, hospital name withheld, San Francisco, CA. Recent study of the degenerative disease, which targets motor functions and conjunctive decline, often leads to hallucination of the deceased. The death of the target cells and chemicals in his brain by the deceased led to a lost sense of smell, among other senses. The cause of death targeting cells and chemicals of hit by the deceased, leading to the loss of smell and other senses. The cause of the disease is unknown. Hallucination of 39.8% of patients falling into categories sensing a presence of a sideways passage or illusion, presence in 2.5% of patients. A sideways passage or illusion present in 2.5% of the patients. From visual hallucinations present in the 2.2%, isolation 9.3%, and auditory hallucination and present in 9.7%, isolation in 2.3%. Continuing the study in San Francisco, CA, present 2003.